So I'm a writer, and one of the things I love to do the most is deliver an aha moment to the reader. This experience comes in different forms. It might be that the reader was able to foresee some turn of plot before it was revealed, or that the place they expected the plot to go turned out to be the wrong destination. Or maybe the character the reader thought they knew ends up being a stranger. I think this can sometimes create a sense of disorientation, which doesn't necessarily need to be unpleasant, not if it's done correctly anyway. My own favorite author of all time, Gene Wolfe, crammed entire novels full of these moments. He wrote in multiple dimensions, so that his stories, taken at face value, conveyed a certain meaning. But then there was something deeper happening in his work as well. The characters populating his world were never what you suspected at first glance. Someone you thought was a man may have been a robot. Aliens once considered monstrous may have actually been angelic. The hero of the story, dutifully narrating the most secret and personal experiences of his or her life, may not even have been telling you the truth. It was Wolfe's genius to obscure this deeper dimension in his work. He left hints for his readers. Breadcrumbs, you might call them, but I believe the analogy doesn't hold. Try to sustain yourself on a diet of Gene Wolfe's breadcrumbs alone, and you'll see what I mean. You probably starve. He never explained anything. He gave no clear answers outside of the hints, the intentional inconsistencies that dotted the landscape of his writing. Sometimes it was so dense that reading his material with what I'll call relaxed attention produced an experience very much like a fever dream. He made it a frequent practice to leave out key scenes that conventional fiction teaches us must be explored. In multi-volume series, he seemed to delight in ending one volume on a cliffhanger, only to follow it with a story that picks up several months later, never explaining to the reader what actually happened in the interval. The hints were there for us to fill in the gaps, if we caught them, but often those hints were spread out over the entirety of the work. Wolfe's stories rewarded multiple readings. This may sound rather obnoxious to you, and I suppose your reaction is quite normal. It was certainly mine, the first time I attempted one of his books, and given that he seems not to have been a widely known author, and I have heard him described as the best science fiction author you've never heard of, I'll assume that most readers would prefer a little more help from the storyteller in understanding what the hell is going on. Gene Wolfe was not one for spoon-feeding. Such was my experience when I began reading my copy of The Shadow of the Torturer, now over 2 decades ago. Right away I felt as though I floundered in deep water. It was like I could read the text, but my brain was somehow missing every 7th word. I felt disoriented, as if there were whole layers of context I simply could not see. Feelings emerged as certain details failed to add up. Feelings of myself, I mean, not the work. It felt as if there was a code somewhere, buried in his words, and I just couldn't see it. So I finished the series. It was part of a 4-part story, put it aside, and tried to forget about it.
No more damn books. No more books.
But I couldn't. Actually, I couldn't stop thinking about the damn thing at all. So after I'd had enough time away from it, I picked the series back up again and started from page 1. Then on that second reading, something special began to happen. Now I don't know if it was because I'd read the series once all the way through already, or because I went into the second reading expecting to be confused as hell, and so was paying close attention. But on that second reading, details began to stand out. I was noticing things I'd missed before, and now picking them up on the second pass, while having the benefit of the entire series already in my mind, many of those things were beginning to make sense. Years of school and college and graduate school aside, this was probably one of the single greatest lessons I would ever learn in the art of storytelling. If the readers are engaged in the story, or if you make them active participants, that story tends to embed deeper into their brains. It stays with them, and when they start to figure it out, there's a tremendous sense of accomplishment that follows. In my case, studying and beginning to understand Wolfe's stories has been one of the most rewarding reading experiences of my life. And obviously, this brings me to Star Wars. I was thinking about this the other day, this idea of recontextualization within a story. It's like stage magic. You're leading the reader down one kind of path, if they're not watching you carefully, and then later you may, to whatever degree desired, smack them over the head with some revelation that forces them to reconsider everything they thought they knew. It's all smoke and mirrors, it's misdirection. And because I don't see much difference between visual and written media, it's my practice to consider film and TV as often as I do books, and how various audiences react to the material with which they are presented. In this case, I looked at the recontextualization of Johnny Lawrence in Cobra Kai and compared it to the Emperor Palpatine in The Rise of Skywalker. So what do these two examples have to do with each other? Well, very little, honestly. Mr. Lawrence's recontextualization has been roundly embraced by fans of the original movies, whereas Palpatine's was soundly derided by fans both old and new alike.
This is borderline experimental.
This makes no sense at all.
So that's interesting to me. There's something going on here, and it's to our benefit to understand what it is. When I say recontextualization, what I'm really talking about is new information provided to the audience that forces them to reconsider certain truths or rules they thought they understood. These rules could apply to anything. They might have to do with the story's magic system or a key historical event, or indeed a sequence of events that have been interpreted to mean something. For example, consider the final fight in The Karate Kid, the All Valley tournament. Even if you saw this fight in isolation, without any of the surrounding story to inform your opinion, you would probably still interpret these events the same way. Johnny is the clear antagonist. He is the more aggressive of the two fighters. Look at their attire. Daniel in the white gi while Johnny pursues him in black. The expressions they wear are likewise in opposition. Johnny shows raw anger as he chases Daniel around the mat, which soon includes a large degree of frustration and self-directed hate due to his own inability to end the match. Daniel, on the other hand, shows a kind of wide-eyed, deer-in-the-headlights panic. He's been hurt several times by now, and we see him favoring several physical weak points throughout the match. He's been soundly battered, and yet if you look closely, you can see confidence growing in his eyes. This is a process of Daniel facing his greatest fear. This is David taking on Goliath, and as the fight develops, David is learning that Goliath isn't the giant he feared. Johnny's throwing everything he has at Daniel, is even cheating, and Daniel is still standing. Daniel is realizing at this moment that he has the tools to meet this challenge. He's realizing he deserves to be here. He's not an imposter. He has as much right to be in this place as all the other contestants. Right away, we have a clear idea as to who the protagonist and antagonist are. You probably don't even need to see the scene play out in real time. If we took snapshots of this event and showed them to random strangers on the street who hadn't seen these movies before and said, "Who's the bad guy here?" there's no real mystery in what answer we would get. It's this guy. The fight concludes, the movie's over, a few terrible sequels are made, and everyone moves on with their lives. But now in 2020, the age of the Hollywood retread, which I have chosen to symbolize here with the image of the Ouroboros, risk-averse executives seeking to protect exorbitant investment fees in a marketplace where movie stars no longer exist, large studios can no longer take risks on new stories or ideas. They are reduced to a constant cycle of asking, "What have we got?" while thumbing through a catalog of IP that has demonstrated some sort of buzz, really any sort of buzz, in the past. This is now the way of the world. Unless we're discussing smaller independent film, virtually nothing is made anymore unless it comes equipped with a prepackaged audience. Enter Cobra Kai, the 80s franchise continuation nobody asked for, but everyone suddenly loves anyway. Cobra Kai represents that rarest of mythological beast, the 80s nostalgia cash grab that actually seems to be well done, and managed by people who give a shit. Just think about this a moment. This series should have failed. It should have been something we all forgot about 1 month after it was released. It should have been eye-rolled into oblivion. How many times have we seen this before? And yet here we are now. How has this worked? Make no mistake, this series comes from a place of cynicism. Somewhere, there was an executive in a suit with his or her thumb on a button, and the only thing that saw that button pressed was the realization that nostalgia sells. There's a built-in audience, and hey fellas, what have we got? We've got to develop something, right? There's got to be something from the 80s that hasn't been mined for every last drop of goodwill.
Right?
But despite the cynicism, at some point, people who gave a shit got their hands on this thing, assuming they didn't have their hands on it from the very beginning. They had to shop the idea around to the bean-counting vampires. And there's at least one person in that group who knows how to write characters and understands this concept of recontextualization. Johnny Lawrence was the bad guy. Not just a bad guy, he was the very avatar of the 80s bully. So much so that William Zabka was asked to reprise the role in completely different movies that had nothing to do with karate. If you grew up during this period, when you thought asshole, you thought about that cocky grin, the flowing blonde locks, and the sky blue piercing eyes of Billy Zabka. And now, whoever it is that's behind this new series, I didn't bother to look them up, has said, hey, let's make him the protagonist. So that seems like it should be hard, right? So what's happening here is that they're adding depth to a character we already know. More dimension. He's grown past a simple rage case, which only existed in the earlier movie to give Daniel an obstacle to overcome. He is now a person. He has dreams, or he had them. He had aspirations, but something somewhere went wrong. We don't know what that is, exactly, but the series goes into overdrive to fill in enough of the blanks for us. Maybe we don't know exactly where it was that Johnny completely went off the deep end, but that doesn't matter. we have a really good idea. It's not surprising. From the perspective of the storyteller or the audience, who both occupy a fantastical parallel universe in which karma is usually alive and well, this rock bottom point is the logical conclusion to the antics he began all the way back in the 80s. There's been a progression here, and even if we haven't witnessed it, we can see it. It makes sense. The series takes the time to show us even more, though. We see the evil Sensei Kreese get his hooks into the boy and start poisoning him with an ultra-militant brand of martial arts, which...
And what is that way? Strike first, strike hard, no mercy, sir! I can't hear you! Strike first, strike hard, no mercy, sir!
Holy Christ, Batman. I guess all the parents in the 80s were too coked out to drop into the dojo every so often and see what their kids were being taught. Good God. Carry on then. And it continues from there. Johnny is down on his luck and seems to be mentally arrested in the glory days of his youth. He lives alone in a low-income apartment, which of itself is nothing to be ashamed of. But when you take his upbringing into account, he was your typical country club teen who came from a well-to-do family, and weigh that against the behaviors and attitudes he's demonstrated over his life, it isn't a stretch to suppose he's humiliated by his position. The humbling of his character opens a pathway to the audience's empathy. The show reinforces this position by surrounding the character with people who are, should we say, less than savory?
Look, the kid's a social reject. He doesn't have a single friend.
It helps the narrative to set Johnny at rock bottom. This places him in a vulnerable position, and for most people with a functioning sense of empathy, it is hard to hate someone so apparently pitiful. Johnny has now been cemented in the underdog position, and it's the position we all love to root for. After the repositioning of his character has been achieved, Miguel Diaz is introduced into the mix. A strongly written character in his own right, Miguel's introduction to Johnny's world gives us a chance to see the latter's evolving attitude toward weakness. Miguel starts the show as the forever bullied, the trodden upon. This is an archetype Johnny has been trained to disdain. Younger Johnny would have scoffed at Miguel. He would have stepped right over him without a second thought. But we are shown someone different to who we remember. He cannot scoff. He can't overlook Miguel. Likely due to his own down-and-out state, Johnny recognizes and sympathizes with the youth. And even so, he does not jump forward heroically to save him. The transition of Johnny's character to that of a role model must be gradual. It is therefore the mistreatment of Miguel combined with the mistreatment of his own sweet, sweet ride that inspires him to protest. The dependencies of these characters upon each other will continue to be explored throughout the show on multiple levels. From the perspective of narrative, Miguel is essential to Johnny's growth as a person. In order for him to mature, Miguel's dependence is necessary. Johnny must respond to it, and the ways in which he does right by the kid and the ways in which he lets him down inform his growth. When he sees what his interaction does to Miguel and experiences how these results make him feel, we as the audience see the seed of Johnny's eventual maturation to that of a role model or father figure. From the perspective of simple story mechanics, the Miguel character is necessary for the audience to accept Johnny's growth. We couldn't simply start the show with Johnny in a repentant or virtuous state. We wouldn't accept such a fundamental change on its face. It is essential that we first see the fruits of his broken philosophy, and we must come along with him as he experiments with new and better ways of interacting with his surroundings and the people he encounters. It is no coincidence that the character seems to have spent the last 30 years in a state of suspended development, with no apparent understanding of today's pop culture or technology. It's almost as though he's been living in a cave.
Yeah, asshole, I clicked all the buttons, I still can't find the internet.
Or perhaps he's just been frozen in a lab for the last few decades and has missed everything that's happened since we last saw him. The show plays this for laughs, but make no mistake, there are storytelling mechanics at play here. For the audience to accept him as a person, and to accept his growth into the new person the show needs him to become, he cannot be too different from his 1980s incarnation. If he had been, we would have demanded story details to fill in that gap, except that's the very story they want to explore in this show. Therefore, he's been living in a cave. Our acceptance of this character as the series' protagonist is assisted by Daniel LaRusso's character, who is initially presented in a manner too smarmy to be universally admired. Sure, he has a wonderful life, a dream home, healthy children, gorgeous wife, and a successful career, but something about him seems off. Actually, he seems to be a first-class doofus. He carries this holier-than-thou attitude born from years of success, and often places himself over those around him as some kind of wise teacher. It is the classic salesman archetype, the person who must telegraph success in all aspects of his being, partly because success is a part of his business. And I think it was a real stroke of genius on the part of the writers that he be a car salesman rather than, say, a real estate agent. For one thing, it fits well with his character's history, all that time working on classic cars with his former master, and yet on the other hand, can we really ignore the car salesman archetype in this instance? Just saying those words together, car and salesman, conjures up images of disingenuous, plastic, unctuous hucksters, snake oil salesmen forever dry washing their hands. And if you happen to be a car salesman, sorry. You must admit it's a perception that exists. People, namely the viewing audience, sometimes seem hard-coded to draw certain conclusions when presented with established characteristics. This is a shorthand that the writers use to bypass the audience's logic circuits and dig directly into their lizard minds. Or in the words of the immortal Mr. Plinkett, you might not have noticed, but your brain did. Daniel LaRusso will, of course, have his own character arc as the series progresses, and we do see him grow in interesting ways. But for now, these are the initial conditions of the story. It all works. It all makes sense. We find it acceptable. Then the coup de grace is delivered when Johnny relates his perception of events during the time of the Karate Kid.
It was the summer of '82. Rocky III had just come out. My buddy Dutch was a huge Mr. T fan, so we went to the local theater to check it out. Sitting in front of us was this group of cute chicks eating popcorn. And Dutch started throwing milk duds at them.
What? Why would he do that?
Cause it's an alpha move, man. Babes love when you treat them like crap. Anyway, eventually the girls got so pissed off, one of them stood up and started yelling at us. That's when I saw her for the first time.
Saw who?
Allie. She dumped popcorn all over Dutch, got butter all over him. I could tell right away, man. This chick was a firecracker.
So did you ask her out?
Yeah, I hit on her a few times till she gave me a chance. Went to golf and stuff for our first date. Kissed on the Ferris wheel. We were madly in love. Dated for 2 years. For Valentine's Day, instead of rings, I gave her this pink jelly bracelet. She gave me this.
So then what happened?
Summer before my senior year, we got into a fight. I figured we'd work things out eventually. But then Daniel LaRusso came to town.
This is it. This is the end of the line.
Next thing I know, he's hitting on her. I see the two of them flirting with each other.
What do you do?
Oh, I walked over to have a civil conversation with Allie.
What is your problem? Look, why don't you just take your little Cobra Kais and get out of here?
Oh, right? Yeah, right. That's gonna solve everything. But LaRusso kept butting it.
Come on.
Yeah, just get all right.
I told him to get lost, mind your own business. Out of nowhere, the guy sucker punched me.
What an asshole.
I know, man. I did what any dude would do. I defended myself. You know, I figured that was that. But LaRusso wouldn't leave it alone. At the Halloween dance, I'm sitting there minding my own business. He douses me with the water hose. Haven't seen the guy in months. Fucking turns a water hose on my head. So I chase him down, try to put an end to things that night, right? Turns out the guy's got a karate master of his own. Guy comes out of nowhere, jumps us, assaults me and my friends. I think my buddy Tommy got brain damage because of that fight.
Oh my God.
Eventually, we decided to work things out at the All Valley tournament.
Ladies and gentlemen, may I have your attention, please? The final match, Daniel LaRusso, Miyagi-Do Karate versus John Lawrence of the Cobra Kai.
So we both made it to the finals. It was 2-2.
What happened? Who won?
LaRusso won. I lost.
Right away, we see a story with which we have been intimately familiar in a new light. Seeing this perspective, can we continue to look on Johnny as a reformed bully? Maybe so. He still responds to situations with violence, but at the same time, Daniel wasn't exactly demonstrating heroic behavior. Are we now more likely to see Johnny as a warped individual? Someone who is led astray by people he should have been able to trust? For Johnny Lawrence, Cobra Kai is a story of redemption. And when you understand just how much work the people managing this show are putting in to set up and progress his character, not to mention the others in the show, they all seem to have engaging, satisfying arcs, I think you begin to appreciate just how much effort and finesse is involved in the effective recontextualization of a known character. Having explored a fine example of successful recontextualization, we may now dive into an example of utter failure, Emperor Palpatine the Clone. I will not recount the many ins and outs of where this film series went off the rails. Setting that all aside, we had arrived at the rise of Skywalker, Emperor Palpatine was back with no real explanation, and there were very few people in the audience who did not smell the rank desperation of a collection of executives positively begging the fandom to please, please, please like this movie.
What is happening?
And it truly did come off as desperate. Snoke was presented as the new big bad of the franchise, but was then unceremoniously dispatched at the midpoint, with seemingly little thought given at all to whosoever must come after to wrap up the story. With a fractured fan base, the executive overlords were compelled by the stockbrokers to step in and dictate that the next movie had better damned well satisfy. And nobody had really seemed to like Snoke as the big nasty in the first place, so what have we got, fellas? Well, the in-canon explanation for what they landed on is that the Emperor, having been tossed down a Star Wars pit by Darth Vader, transferred his soul into a clone body that had been prepared on Exegol, and has been pulling the strings ever since. Never mind that it would have made more sense for the newly transplanted Emperor to start pumping out propaganda debunking his supposed death to avoid his empire from collapsing. Never mind it really makes no sense for him to have a whole jar full of Snokes. Never mind that the existence of Snoke doesn't really make any sense at all in the first place. In fact, never mind that nothing about these movies makes any sense at all. The chief problem is that they never had an endgame in mind when they started writing these films, and therefore had no target toward which they could build. We always hear about JJ's puzzle box approach to filmmaking, which can be a valid method to be sure. It's just that JJ's not very good at it. And then his task was rendered impossible by a studio head either unwilling or unable to keep the story aligned along a coherent path. If you're going to pursue the puzzle box approach, someone, somewhere, has to know what's in the goddamn box, and it's clear in this case they never had a clue, or if they did, they forgot to tell Rian Johnson about it. So the first thing we must do is figure out what's inside the box. We have to go with something, anything, and plan for that. It doesn't have to be perfect, or even really innovative. It just has to be there and functional. It seems no one was really excited about Palpatine being in the box, but let me ask you to consider something. Return of Skywalker Palpatine is the most unsettling and evil version of the character we've ever seen. Not a cackling cartoon, as he was in the prequels. Not a puppet master controlling a big goon in a suit. He was nightmare fuel. He was the only thing about the film that was, for me, menacing or interesting. He was impressive, whether the overall execution was silly or not. Super lightning hands were ridiculous, of course, and the final battle of that film was a farce. But the basis of something very sinister was there. If this trilogy is meant to complete the Skywalker saga, it's only right that the antagonist is the Emperor. He was always the light side's antithesis. The Snoke character was only ever a budget Emperor anyway, just as Kylo Ren ended up a budget Vader. If you take the entire series as a whole, starting from the prequels, it was always the Emperor. It started with the Emperor. It should end with the Emperor. Palpatine was one of the few things JJ got right. Excellent. Now we must decide how to get him back into the story so that the audience at large doesn't say it's a stupid idea bereft of creativity. Which they did. That's not too hard, fortunately. In fact, using the Emperor solves a lot of the problems series detractors have been pointing out since episode 7. For example, the question of resources. I've seen this question posed time and again. Where the hell did the First Order get their resources? An apparently limitless supply of ships, soldiers, influence, and territory. What is the source of this power? Did the New Republic somehow not notice this threat growing for the last several decades? If we use Palpatine, questions of resources and origin can be satisfied. He comes from a time when the Empire enjoyed total despotic control over the galaxy. Christ, he founded the Empire. He had access to unlimited wealth and resources, and he was a man known to favor backup plans behind backup plans. Seriously, 2 Death Stars. Additionally, he never shared information freely among his generals.
Kill him now.
You got the feeling in the original trilogy that the only person with whom he really shared anything at all was Darth Vader. And even then, you could tell that Vader wasn't completely in the loop.
Now, fulfill your destiny and take your father's place at my side.
And this is also important, the idea that secrets were kept from Vader. Otherwise, you'd expect Anakin's Force ghost to warn Luke that Palpatine was still out there. So how about this? Palpatine has another secret facility out there in space, okay? It's where Palpatine Prime has hidden himself after establishing Imperial rule. He installs a clone decoy to rule publicly, controlled remotely through the Force. Not even Vader was aware he was dealing with a clone, because he would have felt Palpatine's presence through the clone's Force connection thingy. After the New Republic was established, the spirit of Anakin visits Luke, briefly, to warn him that Palpatine is still out there. Anakin can't give much detail though, his time is very limited. Palpatine's power is growing all the time, and he can detect Anakin's attempts to reach back into the physical world. Something. So Anakin's spirit must be careful not to arouse the old Emperor's suspicions. The only reason Anakin was able to reach out to Luke at all was that some new Force-intensive task has the Emperor distracted. It has created the slim window Anakin needed to reach out, but now he must fade quickly or be discovered, blah blah blah. Maybe that's why Luke disappeared. Maybe that's what he was looking for, the location of the Emperor's hidden base. I think it's possible that this was always the intention from the get-go. I think this was what JJ had planned from the beginning, and what Trevorrow had agreed to pick up when he took the reins for Episode 9. Johnson tossed a spanner into the works though, so... But now we can make Luke's exile in TLJ work as well. What if Luke came really close to finding the Emperor? What if he got a taste of the Emperor's power? And what if he understood in some way that it was always Palpatine's plan to possess his body? I think a lot of people didn't like the whole possession angle presented in Rise of Skywalker. However, I think this was a strong idea that had merit. For one, it gives Palpatine some much needed motivation, outside of the motivation to just be Space Hitler. I like the idea that Palpatine can extend his reach through controlling clones of himself, and that he can extend his life through technology or the unnatural use of the Force. But all gifts must come with limitations. We could say here that Palpatine cannot possess a clone body permanently, or that he can only permanently possess a person with whom he enjoys a familial bond through the Force, rather than some genetic link. The mechanism of possession should be through the Force, and the Force is mystical in nature. We could say that clones lack the Force equivalent of a soul and are therefore unsuitable for possession. I don't know. It could come off as ham-fisted and contrived, but with the correct handling, I feel like this angle might serve as a gateway into considering the morality of utilizing clone armies. In the correct hands, it could be amazing. For Palpatine to realize a long-term solution to his advancing age, he would require a vessel with a familial connection grounded in the Force. Familial. As I recall, Palpatine was supposed to have created Darth Vader. That was at least heavily implied in Sith. So, Luke is Palpatine's grandson? Then, right? From a certain point of view? I guess it isn't so crazy that Rey could be his granddaughter in that case. Palpatine monkeyed around with the Force and created Darth Goddamn Vader, one of the most effective henchmen in history. Vader systematically hunted down and destroyed all of the Jedi. Why would Palpatine give up that strategy after it yielded such incredible success? He wouldn't, obviously. He'd be more likely to think, hey, that worked pretty well. Right up until Vader tossed me down a Star Wars pit. But that's okay too. Vader only killed a clone. I think Palpatine would be alright with those odds. Maybe he would understand that the supposed rule of one is a stupid idea, and almost guarantees his apprentice will one day attempt to murder him. Palpatine doesn't seem like the kind of gangster to just wait for that to happen though, does he? It seems like he's the type to have a backup plan for such concerns. Finally, I like the idea of Palpatine seeking to extend his life through the possession of a family member because it serves to tie this new trilogy to the older original trilogy. Palpatine's plan in Jedi, as originally presented, never made a lot of sense to me. He was always urging Luke to strike down Vader, or to strike down himself.
Take your weapon. Strike me down with all of your hatred, and your journey towards the dark side will be complete.
He urged Luke to use his hate and become the most powerful of them all. And as a kid, I always wondered, okay, if Luke does that, the Emperor wins morally, but he'll still be dead. How is this a win? Now at the time, I just figured the Emperor was so powerful that Luke was never a threat to him at all, with or without a lightsaber. No matter what Luke might have tried, the Emperor had a counter. Only then Luke would have fallen to the dark side and become a puppet just like his father. And yeah, I know this is actually what they intended when they first shot the film. Just don't pay attention to that right now. What if it was Palpatine's plan all along to actually be killed? What if he wanted Luke to kill the clone body, thus temporarily detaching Palpatine's Force spirit. Luke would be fully open to the dark side at that moment, thus leaving him vulnerable to the incursion of Palpatine's disembodied essence. It would certainly explain the Emperor's fetish to have everyone kick his ass all the time. And maybe that was his plan for Vader in the prequel trilogy too, only Vader suffered a 40% reduction in physical real estate, and Palps wanted a fully intact body to inhabit, and not some crippled, mechanized monstrosity. Vader was certainly a lot cooler in that suit, but on the other hand, walking around in an ambulatory iron lung must be quite the handicap when seeking to get space laid. What if that's why Luke has hidden himself away on some random planet? Instead of him giving up because he sucked at being a teacher, let's say he actively hid himself away because he finally realized what the Emperor's plan was. His whereabouts have to be an extreme secret, and he cannot use the Force because Palpatine will detect it. But Luke has also been funneling information back to Leia along other channels because Palpatine is out there and something has to be done. So Luke's location must be secret, and Leia understands this. She's trying to press the idea with the new government that the threat of Palpatine still exists, but the rest of the Senate knows he blew up in the Death Star, right? Now there are different political factions within the New Republic, people who have become complacent and spend more time jockeying for power than they do addressing any real problems. Trust me, general audiences would have no trouble at all in accepting this concept. And isn't that wonderful? Luke never gave up. He was protecting the galaxy from what might happen if Palpatine got his way, if Palpatine got his body. Despite hiding, Luke would still be doing whatever he could to make his sister and the Republic aware of the threat. Yet a sizable faction of this new government, and I stress, a government, not a loose band of freedom fighters, is rightfully skeptical. Palpatine is still out there? How? You're being ridiculous. And now Leia has something to do other than shuffle around from chair to chair, grinding her way through clunky dialogue. We would get to see her in a new role. Not as a general, but a master statesperson. I imagine a kind of climax could have come about somewhere at the end of the first movie where she finally gets the rest of the Senate to see the light. I bet it could have been quite the character moment for her. And then what about all the magical resources needed to rebuild the Imperial fleet, the collection of ships that the movies called the First Order? Even though we knew damned well it was really just budget empire. Again, Palpatine originates from a time in which he enjoyed total control of limitless resources. Let's say his hidden base really is the Sith homeworld, okay? What if the Sith homeworld is just a dead rock with a hollow core? Perhaps it's hollow because Palpatine's hidden a base inside of it. He's been hollowing the planet out for decades as part of a secret mining operation to support such doomsday projects as the Death Star and so on. It's poetic when you think about it. The basis of the Sith master and apprentice relationship is one of parasitic destruction. One master, one apprentice, and the apprentice always comes to the same end. Become the master through murder or be murdered in the attempt. In this case, it makes sense that Palpatine would mine the Sith homeworld down to an empty shell for his own purposes. He becomes a metaphor for the ingrained self-destructive streak all Sith seem to embody. Can you imagine how much material you could amass if you made it a practice to mine the guts out of dead planets? The scientific answer is a metric shit ton, and we know the Imperials have the technology to do this. They can build moon-sized space stations that blow up planets. They can at least dig a big damned hole. So I think that's it for now. What do you think? Do you think Palpatine could have been saved as a character, even if he was a clone? Do you think these ideas have any merit, or would you have done it a different way? Let me know, I guess. Leave a comment. I'll see it. I'll read it. Hello?
What's